There is a moment that repeats itself in courthouse hallways and suburban driveways across the country. A moment that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with ownership. It happens the instant a piece of paper is signed, the instant a lock is changed, the instant a woman says the word no and means it for the first time in years. It is the moment a controlling man understands, on some level beneath language, that the person he believed belonged to him has stopped believing it herself. Most people call what follows a crime of passion. The phrase is comforting because it suggests spontaneity, an eruption, a man pushed past some human limit by grief he could not contain. It suggests the violence was, in some tragic sense, an accident of the heart. The clinical record tells a different story. What follows a separation is rarely an eruption. It is, in case after case, a campaign, plotted, resourced, and executed with the same cold precision a man might once have brought to closing a business deal or trying a case before a jury. The tragedy is not that these men lost control. The tragedy is that losing control was never really the danger. The danger was what they did to regain it. We have spent a great deal of time on this channel inside a single house on Marina Drive in San Diego, inside the marriage of Dan and Betty Broderick, inside a divorce so vicious it became a made-for-television spectacle and eventually a homicide. We have told that story from more than one angle now. The fingerprint evidence, the competing psychiatric testimony, the children who were asked in open court what they could prove rather than what they felt. Each time, we treated the Broderick case as its own self-contained tragedy, a collision of two damaged people who happened, catastrophically, to marry each other. Tonight we are going to argue that this framing, while true, is also too small. Dan Broderick was not an aberration. He was a case study, one especially well-documented example of a psychological pattern that recurs, with eerie consistency, in courtrooms and coroners' reports from every state in the country. Strip away the specific names, the specific zip codes, the specific professions, and what remains is a blueprint. A particular species of man, wired for entitlement, who experiences the loss of a marriage not as heartbreak, but as theft. Not as sorrow, but as insult. And who responds to that insult the way entitled people have always responded to being told no. By attempting, through whatever means are available to him, to take back what he has decided is rightfully his. This is not a story about anger. Anger burns hot, and then it passes. This is a story about entitlement, which does not pass, because entitlement is not an emotion. It is a belief system. It is the quiet, load-bearing conviction that one's own needs, one's own comfort, one's own narrative of the marriage, simply outrank everyone else's. For years, that belief system can hide behind charm, competence, and generosity, because when a man who believes the world owes him deference is also getting that deference, he can be genuinely, effortlessly pleasant to be around. The mask only slips when the deference stops. And nothing stops deference faster, or more completely, than a wife who files for divorce. Researchers who study lethal violence between intimate partners have a term for the period immediately surrounding a separation. They call it separation assault, a phrase coined by the legal scholar Martha Mahoney to describe the specific, predictable spike in danger that occurs not during the marriage, but at the exact moment the marriage ends. The data behind that term is sobering. Women are statistically at their highest risk of being killed by a partner not while they are living with him, but after they have left him, or in the act of trying to. Police departments, family court judges, and domestic violence advocates have known this for decades. It is why so many protective order hearings ask, almost ritually, whether the petitioner believes her safety is at greater risk now that she has filed. The honest answer for a specific and identifiable category of men is almost always yes. And it is almost always because those men do not experience separation as loss. They experience it as defiance. Over the next hour, we're going to build that blueprint piece by piece. We will look at the psychological architecture of narcissistic entitlement, not as a pop psychology insult thrown around on social media, but as a clinically recognizable pattern with its own internal logic, its own predictable stages, its own well-documented warning signs. We will look at how that pattern hides in plain sight for years, wearing the costume of a devoted husband, a pillar of the community, a man everyone at the country club would vouch for. We will trace the specific moment the mask begins to slip. Not at the wedding, not at the first argument, but at the first real challenge to control. We will follow the pattern through the private tyranny that so often exists behind a public reputation for charm. We will examine the collapse, the precise psychological mechanism by which a narcissistic man converts the shame of rejection into the fuel for rage. We will walk through the unmasking, the phase in which that rage stops being a feeling and becomes a strategy, deployed through family courts, through finances, through surveillance, and in the most extreme cases, through violence. And we will close by asking what it costs, the families, the children, the systems that are supposed to protect people and too often do not, and what, if anything, we have learned well enough to change it. We are not here to relitigate whether Dan Broderick deserved what happened to him, or whether Betty Broderick deserved the decades in prison that followed. That case has been picked over from every angle, including by us. Tonight, the Brodericks are our starting point, not our subject. Our subject is bigger and, frankly, more disturbing because it is not confined to one marriage or one decade. It is a pattern hiding inside an enormous number of ordinary-looking divorces happening right now, in houses that look nothing like Marina Drive, to people whose names will never make the news, until in some fraction of cases they do. It is worth being clear before we go further about the scope of what we are describing and what we are not. Not every difficult divorce involves this pattern. Not every controlling husband becomes violent, and the overwhelming majority of men who exhibit some of the traits we are about to describe never escalate to anything approaching what happened on Marina Drive or in any of the other cases we will reference tonight. What we are tracing is a specific, identifiable subset, a minority of relationships, but a minority large enough and lethal enough that researchers have spent decades trying to map its contours precisely, so that the people living inside it might recognize it sooner than the people who lived through the case's history remembers. Ongoing federal surveys of intimate partner violence consistently find that a meaningful share of female homicide victims in the United States are killed by a current or former intimate partner, and a disproportionate share of those killings cluster around the period of separation rather than the marriage's ordinary, unhappy middle years. That clustering is not random. It is the fingerprint of exactly the psychological mechanism this hour is devoted to explaining. It is also worth acknowledging, honestly, the limits of psychological retrospection. We are not in a position to diagnose any specific historical figure with a personality disorder from a television screen decades later, and clinicians are rightly cautious about applying formal diagnostic labels to people they have never personally evaluated. What we can responsibly do is describe a well-documented behavioral pattern, recognized across clinical literature, criminological research, and domestic violence advocacy, and observe how consistently that pattern's specific, observable features appear across the documented record of these cases. The recorded phone calls, the sworn testimony, the financial records, the contemporaneous accounts of people who knew these men before anyone suspected what was coming. The value of the pattern is not that it lets us assign a clean diagnostic label to any one man. It is that it lets us see the shape of the danger clearly enough to name it while it is still happening, rather than only in hindsight. Let's begin where every one of these stories begins, not with the violence, but with the version of the man nobody was afraid of yet. Ask the friends, co-workers, and extended family of almost any man who later commits severe post-separation violence what he was like, and you will hear a strikingly consistent answer. Charming. Successful. Generous, sometimes to a fault. The kind of man other men wanted to be friends with, and other women's husbands were quietly told to be more like. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a cover-up by people protecting a monster after the fact. It is, according to decades of research into narcissistic personality patterns, the entire point of the performance. Clinical narcissism, as distinct from the casual, colloquial use of the word to describe anyone vain or self-absorbed, is built around a core psychological contradiction. On the surface sits grandiosity, an inflated, often genuinely felt sense of superiority, exceptionalism, and destiny. Underneath sits something far more fragile, a self-concept that depends almost entirely on external validation to stay intact. The grandiosity is not confidence in the ordinary sense. It is a defense structure built to protect an internal sense of self that cannot tolerate being ordinary, being wrong, or being seen clearly. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a false self, constructed and maintained specifically because the true self feels, to the person carrying it, unbearably inadequate. What makes this pattern so effective at evading detection for years, sometimes decades, is that maintaining the false self requires an audience. A narcissistic man is rarely cruel to people whose admiration he needs and has not yet secured. The boss he is trying to impress, the new neighbors, the future in-laws at Thanksgiving, the courtroom gallery. Charm, in this framework, is not the opposite of control. It is one of its earliest and most effective tools. The same magnetic warmth that makes a man delightful at a dinner party is often the exact mechanism by which he first draws a partner in, a process researchers and clinicians frequently describe using the term love bombing. An early relationship phase marked by overwhelming, almost theatrical displays of affection, attention, and generosity, delivered at a pace and intensity that would, in a healthier dynamic, feel like a warning sign rather than a romance. It rarely feels like a warning sign in the moment because it is calibrated precisely to feel like the opposite, like finally being seen, finally being chosen, finally matching to someone extraordinary. The people who go on to marry these men do not describe courtship as manipulation. They describe it almost universally as the best few months of their lives. That is not an accident of hindsight. It is the mechanism working exactly as intended. A partner who feels chosen, adored, and slightly disbelieving of her own luck is a partner who will extend enormous benefit of the doubt later, when the behavior underneath the performance starts to surface. She is not naive for missing the pattern. She is responding rationally to overwhelming evidence, freshly and deliberately supplied, that this man loves her more than anyone ever has. Dan Broderick's early courtship of Betty is, in this sense, almost a textbook illustration, and it is worth revisiting briefly not to relitigate the marriage, but to notice the shape of the beginning. He was, by every contemporaneous account, magnetic, a driven, ambitious young man on his way to medical school and then law school, who made an unglamorous, financially precarious young couple feel like they were building something extraordinary together. Betty worked to put him through both degrees. Friends from that era describe a partnership that looked, from the outside, like a team, two people sacrificing together for a shared future. What almost none of them clocked at the time was the underlying architecture of that sacrifice. that it flowed almost entirely in one direction, and that the entire value of the partnership, in Dan's internal accounting, existed to the extent it served Dan's ascent. This is the second load-bearing feature of narcissistic entitlement, and it is subtler than grandiosity. A genuine, often unconscious belief that other people's labor, sacrifice, and identity exist primarily in service of one's own trajectory. Clinicians sometimes call this a lack of authentic reciprocity. It does not usually announce itself as selfishness in the early years, because the entitled partner is frequently generous with money, attention, and affection, as long as the relationship's overall direction continues to serve him. Generosity, in other words, functions less as evidence against entitlement and more as one of its most common disguises. A man can buy his wife jewelry, plan elaborate vacations, and brag about her to his colleagues, all while operating from the deep, structural assumption that her role in the marriage is to support his ascent, manage his household, and reflect well on his image. And that any of that support could, at any moment he decided it was warranted, be unilaterally revoked, redirected, or replaced. We saw this same architecture, dressed in a different profession and a different decade, in Jeffrey MacDonald, the Green Beret physician whose public image as a devoted family man survived. For many people, still survives in some corners of true crime discourse, despite the mountain of physical evidence contradicting it. We saw it in Mark Hacking, whose elaborate, sustained lies about his own medical school acceptance were not a single moment of panic, but a years-long performance requiring his wife's complete, structural role as an unknowing supporting character in a story that was never actually about her. In each case, before the violence, before the collapse, there was a mask, and the mask worked because it was not entirely false. These men really could be charming. They really could be generous. The charm and generosity simply existed in service of an entitlement that had not yet been seriously challenged. That is the operative phrase, and it deserves to sit at the center of everything that follows. Not yet seriously challenged. Narcissistic entitlement, as a psychological structure, is remarkably stable for as long as the world continues to organize itself around the entitled person's needs. It requires no particular cruelty to maintain, because cruelty has not yet become necessary. The wife who defers, the colleagues who admire, the community that extends respect on the basis of profession and reputation. None of this requires enforcement, because everyone involved is, for the moment, playing the role the entitled man expects them to play. The mask stays on effortlessly right up until someone in the cast decides to stop performing. Clinicians who work extensively with this population also draw a distinction worth introducing here, because it helps explain why the pattern can look so different from one case to the next while sharing the same underlying architecture. The difference between what researchers sometimes call grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. The grandiose presentation is the one most people picture instinctively: outwardly confident, dominant, comfortable commanding a room, visibly convinced of his own exceptionalism. Dan Broderick, by most contemporaneous accounts, fits this presentation closely. A man whose success was real, whose confidence was not performed so much as fully inhabited, and whose entitlement expressed itself through an assumption of natural authority that other people around him largely accepted without much friction, for years, because he really was as accomplished as he believed himself to be. The vulnerable presentation looks, on the surface, almost like its opposite: quieter, more prone to self-pity, more likely to present as wounded, overlooked, or unfairly treated by the world, rather than triumphantly superior to it. What unites the two presentations, despite their surface differences, is an identical underlying structure. A fragile core self-concept, protected by a defensive layer that, in the grandiose case, takes the form of visible superiority, and in the vulnerable case, takes the form of persistent grievance and a conviction of having been wronged. Both presentations generate the same entitlement to compliance and deference from an intimate partner. Both generate the same narcissistic injury when that compliance is withdrawn. And both are capable of producing the same escalating cycle of control, collapse, and campaign that this hour is devoted to tracing. The vulnerable presentation simply tends to frame its post-separation campaign in the language of victimhood rather than authority, arguing to courts, to mutual friends, to anyone who will listen, that he is the one who has truly been wronged, even while privately orchestrating exactly the kind of punishing pressure campaign more commonly associated with his grandiose counterpart. It is worth pausing here to be precise about something, because the concept of narcissistic entitlement gets thrown around loosely in modern conversation, often as a catch-all insult for anyone selfish or difficult. Clinically, the pattern we are describing involves several interlocking features that researchers have identified with real consistency across offender populations in domestic violence and intimate partner homicide studies. A grandiose but fragile self-image, a persistent need for admiration and validation from others, a genuine deficit in empathy, not an inability to perform empathy, which these men are often extremely skilled at, but a difficulty actually experiencing another person's internal reality as equally real and important as their own, and critically, an entitled expectation of automatic compliance, in which the ordinary friction of two people negotiating a shared life is experienced not as normal relational give and take, but as a kind of insubordination. That last piece is the one that matters most for what comes later, because it reframes the entire emotional logic of what will eventually happen when the marriage ends. For most people going through a divorce, even an angry and painful one, the underlying emotional experience is loss. Grief for a future that will not happen, sadness for a partnership that could not be salvaged, fear about what comes next. For a man operating from deep entitlement, the underlying emotional experience of being left is something closer to theft. Not "she and I did not work out." Something closer to "she took something that was mine." That distinction, loss versus theft, is, according to clinicians who specialize in high-conflict divorce and intimate partner violence, one of the single clearest predictors of which divorces stay merely painful and which divorces become dangerous. It also explains something that puzzles outside observers again and again in these cases: the apparent disconnect between how composed, reasonable, and even sympathetic these men can appear in public settings, depositions, custody evaluations, television interviews, even while they are simultaneously engaged in campaigns of harassment, financial sabotage, or worse, in private. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. It is the mask continuing to perform its original function, adapted to a new and more hostile stage. The man who charmed a room at his own wedding can charm a judge in a custody hearing for exactly the same underlying reason, because the performance of reasonableness has never actually required the private reality to match it. What has changed is not the man. What has changed is the audience he most urgently needs to convince, and the stakes of failing to convince them. We will spend the rest of this hour tracing exactly how that transition happens, how a marriage organized around one person's entitlement begins to fracture, how the private reality diverges further and further from the public performance, and how, when the performance finally fails to hold the marriage together, the entitlement that once expressed itself as charm begins, in a frightening number of documented cases, to express itself as something else entirely. There is a specific relational cycle that clinicians who study narcissistic dynamics have come to describe using 3 stages. idealize, devalue, discard, and it is worth walking through explicitly because it maps almost perfectly onto the courtship to collapse arc we are tracing across this entire hour, and because recognizing it in its early, idealizing phase is one of the few genuine points of intervention available before the pattern hardens into something much harder to escape. The idealizing phase is the love-bombing period already described. Intense, flattering, often disorienting in its intensity, and genuinely wonderful to be on the receiving end of. What makes it dangerous is not the warmth itself, but the speed and totality of it, a pace of attachment that outstrips the normal, gradual process of actually getting to know another person, and that functions, whether or not the entitled partner consciously intends it this way, to secure deep emotional investment before any red flags have had time to surface or register. The devaluation phase begins, in case after case, at the exact moment the relationship has become secure enough, through marriage, cohabitation, children, financial entanglement, that the entitled partner no longer needs to actively work to keep it. This is one of the most counterintuitive and painful realizations for people who have lived through this pattern. The devaluation is not caused by anything the partner did wrong. It is simply what happens once active pursuit is no longer required, because the underlying investment in the relationship was never really about her as a specific, fully realized person. It was about what her admiration, her deference, and her presence provided to him. Once secured, that admiration becomes something closer to an expectation than a gift, and expectations, once unmet even slightly, generate exactly the disproportionate reactions described earlier as narcissistic injury in miniature. Chris Watts's marriage to Shannon Watts, a case this channel has referenced before in other contexts, offers a chillingly contemporary illustration of the same underlying pattern operating inside a far more ordinary, unremarkable-seeming household than the Brodericks' Marina Drive mansion. By every account from friends, family, and Shannon's own extensive social media presence, the Watts marriage looked from the outside like a genuine partnership, a devoted husband, a doting father, a family actively building a life together in suburban Colorado. Investigators and journalists who later reconstructed the marriage's final year found something very different underneath. A husband engaged in a secret affair, increasingly resentful of financial pressures tied to a business venture Shannon had encouraged him into, and according to the eventual accounts of those closest to the case, someone who had begun to experience his wife and children not as a family he was building, but as an obligation constraining a different life he had started to. One instead, the devaluation, in other words, did not require years of visible cruelty to become lethal. It required only the private conviction, sustained perhaps for a shorter window than in the Broderick marriage, that his own comfort and freedom outranked his family's continued existence. A conviction that culminated in August of 2018 in the murder of his pregnant wife and both of their young daughters. We reference the Watts case here not to conflate it wholesale with the Broderick pattern. The specific circumstances, timeline, and eventual violence differ in significant ways, but because it demonstrates something important about the scope of what we are describing. The entitlement pattern is not confined to wealthy, high-profile marriages with attorneys and television cameras. It operates identically and sometimes even more lethally inside households that never make headlines until the worst has already happened, precisely because there is no public drama, no contentious custody battle playing out in open court, to serve as an early warning sign to anyone watching from outside. This is worth sitting with directly. Grandiosity, in clinical terms, does not require wealth, status, or public achievement to sustain itself. It requires only a private conviction of exceptionalism and a partner willing, for a time, to organize her life around confirming it. Some men build that conviction on the back of genuine professional accomplishment, as Dan Broderick did. Others build it on far thinner material, a self-image sustained mostly through the admiration of the one person closest to them, which makes that person's eventual withdrawal of admiration, whatever form it takes, feel exactly as threatening as it would to a man with an actual career's worth of accolades to protect. This is one of the reasons the pattern is so genuinely difficult to screen for in advance, and why well-meaning advice to simply avoid dating obviously arrogant or self-important men misses the mechanism almost entirely. The men at the center of these cases rarely present during courtship as obviously anything. They present as attentive, generous, and genuinely invested, because for as long as courtship lasts, attentiveness and generosity are exactly what the entitlement structure requires of them. The warning signs this hour has been cataloging are, by design, retrospective clarity rather than prospective certainty. They become visible only once the underlying dynamic has had time to operate, which is precisely why understanding the pattern as a pattern, rather than trying to spot a single decisive red flag in the earliest weeks of a relationship, offers the more realistic and more useful form of protection. Every mask eventually meets a moment it was not built to survive, and in a marriage organized around one partner's entitlement, that moment rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in fractures, small, deniable, easily explained away instances where the private reality of the relationship briefly shows through the public performance, and then just as quickly retreats behind it. Understanding these fractures matters enormously, not as an academic exercise, but because they are, according to the domestic violence research literature, the earliest and most reliable warning signs available, visible for years, often before anyone recognizes them as warnings at all. The first fracture is almost always control disguised as care. It rarely begins with an argument. It begins with a question that sounds, on its surface, like concern. Where were you? Who were you with? Why didn't you answer your phone? In a healthy relationship, questions like these are ordinary curiosity, easily answered and quickly forgotten. In a relationship organized around entitlement, they function differently, as a kind of low-grade audit, a running verification that the partner's behavior continues to align with expectations that were never actually negotiated, only assumed. Domestic violence researchers, most notably the sociologist Evan Stark, have argued that this pattern, not isolated incidents of violence, but an ongoing structure of surveillance, restriction, and demand, is the real engine of most abusive relationships. Stark coined the term coercive control specifically to capture this, arguing that physical violence, when it eventually appears, is often not the core of the abuse, but merely its most visible symptom, deployed to enforce a system of control that has usually been operating quietly for a very long time. Coercive control rarely looks dramatic from the outside, and this is precisely what makes it so difficult for outsiders, friends, family, even trained professionals, to recognize before real damage has occurred. It shows up as a husband who just wants to know his wife's schedule, framed as thoughtfulness. It shows up as gradually narrowing her financial independence, framed as practical household management. He handles the money because he's better with numbers, because it's simpler, because she has enough on her plate already. It shows up as subtly discouraging friendships and family closeness, framed as wanting more time together, as not particularly liking her sister, as finding her old friends from before the marriage to be a bad influence. Each individual instance is defensible, explainable, the kind of thing a woman describing it to a friend might catch herself downplaying even as she says it out loud. It's not that big a deal, he just worries about me. What the fracture reveals, for those paying close enough attention, is the underlying logic beneath the care. Control is not being offered as a shared value the couple has agreed to together. It is being unilaterally imposed, adjusted, and enforced by one partner in service of that partner's comfort, and it escalates specifically at the moments when the other partner asserts any independent identity. A promotion at work, a rekindled friendship, a hobby that does not include him. Any signal that her life contains meaning generated somewhere other than the marriage. This is the entitlement from the mask beginning to show its structural requirements. A man who has organized his sense of self around being the center of his wife's world does not experience her growing independence as healthy. He experiences it as a threat to the architecture holding his own identity together, and threats, to an entitled and fragile self-image, demand a response. The second fracture is what clinicians sometimes call narcissistic injury in miniature. The disproportionate reaction to small slights that do not, on their face, warrant it. A wife disagrees with him in front of colleagues at a dinner party, and he is cold and punishing for the rest of the evening, then for days afterward. She makes a decision about the children without consulting him first, and the resulting argument is wildly out of scale with the actual disagreement, because the argument was never really about the decision. It was about the fact that a decision was made without his input, which registers, to an entitled self-concept, not as an ordinary parenting disagreement, but as a small but real erosion of authority. These episodes are often followed by periods of contrition, flowers, apologies, a return to the charming version of the man everyone else still sees. And this cycle, alternating between punishing withdrawal and charming repair, is itself part of the control structure, because it teaches the partner, over time and without either person fully realizing it is happening, to modulate her own behavior to avoid triggering the punishing phase. It is worth being direct about something here. These patterns, described in the abstract, can sound almost universal. Every couple argues, every person has a bad day, every marriage involves some negotiation over independence and household finances. The distinction that domestic violence researchers draw is not about the presence of conflict, which is normal and even healthy in long-term relationships. It is about the direction and permanence of the accommodation. In relationships marked by coercive control and narcissistic entitlement, the accommodation flows overwhelmingly in one direction, and it does not stabilize. It deepens over time, as the partner without the power learns, fracture by fracture, that resistance costs more than compliance, until an enormous number of small daily decisions have quietly been ceded to a single person's preferences, moods, and demands. Betty Broderick's own account of her marriage, delivered across trial testimony, television interviews, and later writing, describes exactly this trajectory, whatever one ultimately concludes about her culpability for what she did afterward. She described a partnership in the early years that felt genuinely mutual. Both of them sacrificing, both of them building, that gradually reorganized itself entirely around Dan's career, Dan's ambitions, Dan's social standing, and eventually, devastatingly, around a much younger woman Dan had begun an affair with while still married to Betty, a woman he would eventually marry. The fractures in the Broderick marriage were visible for years before the divorce filing. His escalating criticism of her appearance and her role as a stay-at-home mother, once his medical and legal careers, made that role financially unnecessary for her to justify. His public embarrassment of her at social events, the widening gulf between the successful, charming doctor and Mr. Broderick that colleagues and friends continued to see, and the isolated, increasingly humiliated woman inside the marriage that almost none of them recognized. It is worth pausing on a question that outside observers of these marriages almost always ask. sometimes with real compassion, and sometimes with an edge of judgment that itself reflects a misunderstanding of how the pattern actually operates. If the fractures were visible, why didn't she leave sooner? The question assumes that recognizing a problem and having the practical, psychological, and social capacity to act on that recognition are the same thing, and research into coercive control consistently finds that they are not. By the time the fractures described above have accumulated into a fully realized pattern, the partner experiencing them has often lost significant independent financial footing, has a narrowed social network less able to offer the kind of sustained practical and emotional support leaving requires, and has been subjected to years of exactly the gaslighting dynamic described earlier. A dynamic whose entire function is to make her doubt whether her own perception of the relationship's severity is even accurate. Betty Broderick herself asked variations of this question repeatedly across decades of interviews, consistently described a period of many years in which she recognized, at some level, that something in the marriage had become badly wrong, while remaining genuinely uncertain whether she was the one overreacting, whether other successful men's wives simply tolerated similar treatment as the ordinary cost of the lifestyle it afforded them, whether leaving a marriage that still looked, to everyone around her, like an enviable success story would make her the unreasonable one. This uncertainty is not a personal failing. It is one of the most well-documented and predictable effects of the pattern itself, engineered, again, not always consciously, specifically to produce exactly this kind of paralysis in the partner losing power inside it. This gap between the version of the relationship visible to outsiders and the version experienced privately by the partner losing power inside it is not incidental to the pattern. It is one of its most important structural features, and we are going to spend the next section examining it directly because it explains something that otherwise seems almost impossible to believe: how a man's friends, family, colleagues, and eventually a judge and jury can look at the same set of facts a victim is describing and simply not see what she sees, right up until the violence makes it undeniable. Before we move there, it is worth naming one more fracture pattern that recurs with striking consistency across these cases, because it functions almost as a hinge between the earlier, more ambiguous forms of control and the more overt entitlement that follows. The reaction to any external validation the partner receives independent of the relationship. A promotion, a compliment from a friend, attention from other men, even entirely innocent attention. Financial success that is hers rather than his. In healthy relationships, a partner's success is a shared source of pride. In relationships organized around entitlement, it is frequently experienced. And here again, the word matters because it is rarely conscious or admitted even to the man himself. As a kind of competition, one that threatens the hierarchy the relationship has quietly been operating under. Watch closely enough, in the years before any of these marriages end in violence, and you will often find this exact moment. The wife starts succeeding at something entirely her own, and the temperature in the house changes. Financial control deserves particular attention among these early fractures, because it is simultaneously one of the most common and one of the most invisible tools available to an entitled partner, and because its consequences compound silently for years before anyone, including the person experiencing it, fully registers their scale. It rarely begins as outright deprivation. It begins far more often as a reasonable-sounding division of labor. He handles the investments, the taxes, the major financial decisions because he is, after all, the one with the professional background in it, or simply the one who has always been more comfortable with numbers. Over time, this division hardens into dependency. Bank accounts consolidate into his name, or into accounts she has limited practical access to. Career sacrifices that once seemed mutual and temporary. Staying home with young children, relocating for his professional opportunities, deprioritizing her own earning potential in service of the household, quietly become permanent, and by the time any conflict serious enough to make her consider leaving arrives, she often finds she has no independent financial footing to leave from. Domestic violence economists who study this pattern refer to it as economic abuse, and they have found, with striking consistency, that it functions as one of the single most effective mechanisms keeping women inside relationships they would otherwise leave. Not because they fail to recognize the relationship's problems, but because the practical machinery of leaving has been quietly dismantled, one reasonable-sounding financial arrangement at a time. Betty Broderick's own financial position within her marriage illustrates this dynamic with particular clarity, precisely because it defies the intuitive assumption that wealth insulates a woman from this kind of vulnerability. She had worked to put Dan through both medical school and law school in the marriage's early years, a period during which the couple's finances were, by necessity, genuinely shared and genuinely precarious together. Once Dan's medical and legal careers began generating substantial income, that shared financial footing did not evolve into shared financial security for Betty. Control over the family's now considerable resources consolidated increasingly around Dan, structured through business entities, investment accounts, and legal arrangements Betty had limited visibility into and even more limited independent access to, despite the fact that the wealth those structures protected had been built, in significant part, on the strength of the earlier years in which her own labor had made Dan's education possible in the first place. This is one of the crueler ironies embedded in the economic abuse pattern. The same partner who often sacrificed the most to build the family's eventual financial success frequently ends up with the least independent access to it once the marriage reaches its final, most dangerous phase. Gaslighting, a term now used so loosely in popular culture that its clinical precision has been somewhat diluted, refers specifically to a pattern of psychological manipulation in which one partner systematically undermines the other's confidence in her own perception, memory, and judgment. In the context of the entitlement pattern we are tracing, it typically emerges not as dramatic, movie-style denial of clearly established facts, but as something far subtler and more corrosive. A consistent, patient reframing of her legitimate concerns as overreactions, of her memory of events as unreliable, of her emotional responses as evidence of instability, rather than evidence of anything actually happening to her. She remembers an argument one way. He insists, calmly and with apparent sincerity, that it happened differently, that she is exaggerating, that she has always had a tendency to catastrophize small disagreements. Repeated over months and years, this pattern does not simply win individual arguments. It slowly erodes the foundation a person needs to trust her own read on her own life, which is precisely what makes her, later, such an unreliable-seeming narrator to outside observers who have only the entitled partner's consistently calm, consistently reasonable public account to compare hers against. Isolation, the third recurring fracture pattern, rarely announces itself as isolation. It arrives dressed as preference. He simply prefers quiet nights at home to her old friend group. He finds her sister exhausting. He would rather the two of them build their own life together than spend so much time embedded in the social worlds either of them had before the marriage. Each individual preference is, again, entirely defensible on its own terms. The cumulative effect, sustained across years, is a partner with a shrinking independent social world and a correspondingly shrinking supply of outside perspectives capable of naming what is happening to her, or of remembering, clearly enough to say so. What she was like before the marriage narrowed her life down to the size he found most comfortable. Relocation frequently accelerates this isolation, and it is worth noting how often it appears, almost as a structural constant, across cases in this category. A career opportunity requires the family to move across the country, away from her extended family and established friendships, into a new community where his professional reputation precedes him and where her own social standing has to be rebuilt from nothing, dependent in the meantime on the very relationships his career has provided access to. None of this needs to be a deliberate isolation strategy to function as one. It only needs to reliably produce the same outcome. A partner increasingly dependent on the entitled spouse not just financially, but socially, for her entire remaining sense of community and belonging, with fewer and fewer people in her daily life who knew her and could vouch for her before the marriage reshaped her. Taken together, surveillance disguised as concern, financial control disguised as practicality, and isolation disguised as preference. These three fractures do not merely coexist. They reinforce each other, each one narrowing the partner's remaining independent resources in a way that makes the others more effective and harder to escape. A partner with no independent income has fewer options for rebuilding a social network after isolation has done its work. A partner with a narrowed social network has fewer people positioned to help her recognize financial control for what it is, or to offer the kind of concrete practical support. A place to stay, help finding a lawyer, simply someone who remembers who she used to be, that leaving successfully so often requires. This is not an accident of overlapping bad luck. It is, according to the researchers who have spent decades mapping this pattern, close to its structural design. By the time a marriage organized around narcissistic entitlement reaches its later years, it has usually developed two entirely separate, internally consistent realities, running in parallel, rarely intersecting, and almost never visible to the same audience at the same time. There is the marriage everyone else can see, the marriage of dinner parties and holiday cards, of professional accolades and community reputation, of a husband other men admire and other women are quietly told to appreciate more. And there is the marriage only one person is actually living inside, a marriage of escalating control, diminishing autonomy, and a partner whose own reality is being slowly, systematically overwritten by someone else's account of events. This split matters enormously to everything that follows, because it explains one of the most persistent and damaging myths surrounding intimate partner violence: the assumption that a man's public reputation is meaningful evidence about his private behavior. It is not. And the reason it is not goes to the very center of narcissistic entitlement as a psychological structure. Remember that the mask described earlier is not a lie told occasionally for convenience. It is a continuously maintained performance, calibrated specifically to whichever audience is watching, and an entitled man's investment in that performance does not diminish as the private marriage deteriorates. If anything, it often intensifies because the public reputation becomes an increasingly important compensatory source of validation precisely as the private relationship stops providing it. Dan Broderick's professional life through the 1980s offers a vivid, well-documented illustration. He was, by that point, one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego, a man whose name carried real weight in local legal circles, admired by colleagues for his aggressive, meticulous courtroom style. Nothing about that professional reputation was fabricated. He really was that skilled, that respected, that effective an advocate for his clients. And none of it told anyone anything reliable about what was happening inside his marriage during the same years, where Betty has described an escalating campaign of humiliation, financial control, and eventually outright psychological warfare, culminating in a divorce and custody battle so vicious it became genuinely, nationally notorious even before the shooting. The two Dan Brodericks, brilliant courtroom advocate, and according to Betty's account, cruel and controlling husband, coexisted in the same person, at the same time, largely invisible to each other's respective audiences. This same pattern recurs with remarkable consistency across cases far removed from San Diego, far removed from the legal profession, involving men whose public reputations spanned everything from military heroism to small-town civic leadership. Jeffrey MacDonald's public identity as a Green Beret physician, decorated, respected, the kind of man whose community rallied around him in the immediate aftermath of his family's murder, existed in near total isolation from whatever was actually happening inside his marriage and his own psychology, a gap so vast that it took years of investigation and litigation to even begin closing it in the public record, and that arguably remains contested to this day among those who still believe his version of events. Mark Hacking maintained for years an entire fabricated professional identity, medical school acceptance, medical school attendance, an imminent transfer to a prestigious program in another state, that his own wife, closest to him of anyone on earth, did not detect as false until almost the moment of catastrophe, because the performance was sustained with such consistency across every audience, public and private, that even sharing a bed with the man provided no reliable window into the truth. Why does this gap persist so stubbornly, resisting detection even from people who love these men, who see them daily, who have every reason and opportunity to notice something is wrong? Several mechanisms operate together, and understanding them is essential to understanding why victims of this pattern are so rarely believed, both at the time and, in some cases, even decades later by true crime audiences revisiting these cases. The first mechanism is what psychologists call impression management as an identity, rather than merely a strategy. For most people, presenting a slightly polished version of oneself in public is a conscious, situational choice. We all behave somewhat differently at a job interview than we do at home, without this constituting deception in any meaningful sense. For a man organized around narcissistic entitlement, the public performance is not a situational adjustment layered on top of a stable private self. It is, in a very real sense, the primary self, the version of himself he most needs to believe in, the version that validates the grandiose self-image protecting the fragile one underneath. The private cruelty is not a mask slipping to reveal the real him, in the way we might intuitively assume. Both versions are, in their own way, fully real, operating according to entirely different rules because they are calibrated to entirely different audiences and entirely different psychological needs. The second mechanism is the systematic undermining of the victim's credibility, often occurring years before any divorce is filed, executed so gradually and so plausibly that it rarely announces itself as a strategy even to the person deploying it. This looks like characterizing a wife as unstable, dramatic, or unreasonable in casual conversation with friends and family, long before any conflict becomes visible enough to require an explanation, laying groundwork, in effect, for a future in which her account of events will be pre-discredited before she has even had occasion to give it. It looks like publicly, gently, expressing concern about a wife's mental health, her drinking, her temper, framed as worry rather than accusation, but landing, cumulatively, as a slow contamination of how everyone in the couple's shared social world perceives her reliability as a narrator of her own life. By the time a marriage like this reaches crisis, the entitled partner has often spent years unconsciously building an audience already primed to disbelieve whatever his wife eventually says about him. Betty Broderick's own reputation, by the final years of her marriage and certainly by the time of her trial, had been shaped by exactly this dynamic, described by Dan's allies and eventually by much of the watching public as unstable, obsessive, unable to let go, a woman whose rage made her an unreliable narrator of her own marriage. Some of that characterization reflected real and serious behavior on her part in the years after the separation. The harassment, the threats, the eventual violence are not in dispute. But the foundation for disbelieving her account of what happened inside the marriage during its intact years had been substantially laid well before any of that behavior existed. Through years of a social performance that positioned Dan as the reasonable, wronged party by default. The third mechanism, and perhaps the most psychologically painful for victims to describe even to themselves, is what researchers sometimes call the credibility gap created by cognitive dissonance in outside observers. Friends, family, and colleagues who have a genuine, positive relationship with the charming public version of an entitled man experience real psychological resistance to accepting evidence that contradicts it, not because they are unusually gullible, but because human beings generally are reluctant to revise strongly held positive impressions of people close to them, especially when doing so would require confronting the possibility that they, too, were deceived for years. This resistance is not usually malicious. It often expresses itself as well-meaning skepticism. Surely there are two sides to this. Surely it's not as bad as she's describing. He's never been anything but kind to me. And it functions, regardless of intent, as a significant structural advantage for the entitled partner precisely at the moment his wife most needs to be believed. The mechanism becomes even clearer when placed alongside cases where the public-private gap survived not just years of marriage, but the extraordinary scrutiny of a criminal investigation. Jeffrey MacDonald's defenders, including a portion of the public that has continued to advocate for his innocence across 5 decades, have consistently pointed to his public reputation. Decorated military physician, respected by colleagues, a man who cooperated with early interviews and appeared, by most accounts, genuinely devastated by the deaths of his wife and daughters, as evidence that the case against him must have been flawed. That reasoning inverts the actual lesson of the double-life pattern rather than applying it. A convincing public performance is not evidence against private violence. It is, if anything, one of its most consistent enabling conditions, precisely because juries, journalists, and the general public tend to weight visible reputation far more heavily than the far less visible, far harder to access, private reality a spouse or family actually experienced. Mark Hacking's case offers perhaps the starkest illustration available of exactly how total this gap can become, because in his case the fabrication was not confined to hidden cruelty behind a charming public face. It extended to the entire architecture of his adult identity. For years, Hacking maintained to his wife, his parents, and his broader social circle that he had graduated from the University of Utah, been accepted to medical school, and was actively attending it. None of it was true. He had never graduated. He had never been accepted anywhere. And yet the fabrication held, article by article of purchased medical textbooks and rehearsed stories about coursework and clinical rotations, for years, collapsing only in the days immediately before Lori Hacking's murder. When the family's planned relocation to North Carolina for the medical school transfer, he had invented threatened, finally, to expose the entire structure at once. What makes the case so relevant to our broader argument is not the murder itself so much as the sheer scale of sustained deception that preceded it. Proof, if any further proof were needed, that the double life this pattern produces is not a minor inconsistency easily caught by attentive observation. It is, in the most extreme cases, a fully constructed alternate reality, maintained with a discipline that can fool even the person sharing a bed with the man every night. Understanding the double life, then, is not simply an interesting psychological footnote. It is the mechanism that explains why so many women describing exactly this pattern, in exactly this kind of marriage, report the same devastating experience. That the hardest part was not enduring the control itself, but trying to describe it to people who could not reconcile it with the man they thought they knew. It is why family courts, staffed by judges and evaluators meeting these men for a handful of hearings, are so frequently outmatched by defendants who have spent years perfecting exactly this kind of performance for exactly this kind of audience. And it is why, when the marriage finally does end, and the private reality can no longer be contained behind the public one, the collapse that follows is so often experienced by everyone watching from the outside as shocking, inexplicable, out of character. When for the person who lived inside the other reality, it was the most predictable thing in the world. There is a broader cultural mechanism reinforcing all three of these individual dynamics, one that operates well beyond any single marriage, and helps explain why the double life persists not just within a couple's immediate social circle, but often within the wider public record, the media, and even the legal system itself. Sociologist Kate Mann has written extensively about a phenomenon she terms himpathy, the disproportionate flow of sympathy, credibility, and benefit of the doubt toward men accused of harming women, particularly men whose social standing, charm, or professional accomplishment makes the accusation feel, to outside observers, dissonant with everything else they think they know about him. Himpathy is not a conscious conspiracy. It is a diffuse, largely unconscious social reflex, and it operates with particular force in exactly the cases we have been describing, because the entitled partner has, by design, spent years cultivating precisely the kind of public reputation most likely to trigger it. Media coverage of these cases, both at the time and in the decades of true crime retrospectives that follow, has historically amplified this dynamic rather than correcting it. Early reporting on the Broderick case leaned heavily on Dan's professional stature and public likability, often treating Betty's escalating desperation as the story's central, colorful drama, while his years of documented humiliation and financial pressure against her received comparatively little scrutiny until much later in the case's public life. This is not a criticism unique to journalism covering the Brodericks specifically. It is a pattern visible across an enormous number of cases in this category, in which the entitled partner's public reputation functions as a kind of protective shield extending well beyond his immediate social circle, shaping how prosecutors, journalists, and eventually juries and audiences approach the underlying facts. Understanding this dynamic is part of what allows a contemporary audience, revisiting cases like this 1 decade later, to see past the framing that shaped how they were originally covered, and to notice the pattern the original coverage so often missed entirely. There is a specific moment, identifiable in case after case with almost clinical precision, at which the entire architecture we have been describing, the mask, the fractures, the double life, stops being sustainable, and something underneath it is exposed for the first time. That moment is not the wedding gone wrong, and it is not any single argument, however severe. It is the moment a wife files for divorce, or otherwise makes clear, in a way that cannot be walked back or reframed, that the marriage is over on her terms rather than his. To understand why this specific moment carries such extraordinary psychological weight for an entitled man, It helps to return to the concept introduced earlier, narcissistic injury. The term, originating in the work of psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, describes a very particular kind of psychological wound, not ordinary disappointment or sadness, but a direct assault on the grandiose self-image that has been protecting a much more fragile sense of self underneath it. A narcissistic injury does not feel, to the person experiencing it, like an ordinary setback. It feels like an existential threat because in a real sense it is one. It threatens to expose, even briefly, the very inadequacy the grandiosity was constructed to hide. A wife filing for divorce is, for an entitled husband, very often the single most severe narcissistic injury available within an intimate relationship, and it is worth being specific about why. It is not simply the loss of companionship, or even the loss of a shared future, though both of those losses are real and painful for anyone going through a divorce. It is specifically the loss of control over the narrative. For years, the entitled partner has been the author of the marriage's public story. The successful man, the reasonable husband, the reliable narrator whose version of events is generally believed. A wife who files for divorce is not merely ending a relationship. She is, in the eyes of an entitled man, seizing the pen. She is asserting a version of the marriage's story, one in which she was mistreated, one in which she has legitimate reasons to leave, that directly contradicts the version he has spent years constructing and believing. And because his sense of self has been organized around maintaining that version, her departure does not register primarily as heartbreak. It registers as a direct, intolerable challenge to his entire self-concept. Some researchers studying this transition describe it using a framework borrowed from earlier psychoanalytic work on shame. What looks, from the outside, like sudden and disproportionate anger is often better understood as a shame-rage spiral, in which an intolerable feeling of humiliation is converted almost instantaneously and largely outside conscious awareness, into anger directed outward at whoever triggered the humiliation. Shame, in this framework, is one of the most psychologically unbearable emotions available to a self-concept built on grandiosity, precisely because it requires confronting exactly the inadequacy the grandiosity exists to hide. Anger, by contrast, is far more tolerable. It restores a feeling of power and moral righteousness, repositioning the entitled partner from a humiliated object of rejection into a righteously wronged party entitled to a response. This conversion happens so quickly and so automatically that the men experiencing it rarely describe it, even to themselves, as anything other than justified outrage at genuine mistreatment. The underlying shame is, in a very real sense, invisible even to the person feeling it, replaced almost instantly by something that feels, from the inside, like righteous fury rather than wounded pride. This is the psychological mechanism behind a phrase that shows up again and again in accounts of these marriages, often from the women themselves, describing a transformation they found genuinely frightening to witness. He became a different person. It is not, in fact, an entirely different person. It is the same underlying entitlement, the same grandiosity, the same fragility, now stripped of the charming performance that had been possible as long as compliance and admiration were still flowing his way. Clinicians describe this shift using the language of narcissistic rage, a specific, often disproportionate anger response triggered not by ordinary frustration, but by exactly this kind of direct threat to a fragile, grandiose self-image. Narcissistic rage is frequently described, by those who have witnessed it, as qualitatively different from ordinary anger. Colder in some moments, hotter in others, but consistently oriented toward restoring a sense of control and punishing whoever is perceived to have taken it away, rather than toward resolving whatever the actual underlying conflict is. Dan Broderick's escalation following Betty's initial attempts to assert independence and eventually pursue divorce followed this trajectory with startling precision, and it is documented extensively through the couple's own words. Letters, recorded phone messages Betty saved and later played in court, and the increasingly vicious tenor of the legal proceedings themselves. What began in the earliest fractures of the marriage, as control disguised as care evolved, once Betty began genuinely asserting independence, into control undisguised, public humiliation, financial punishment, a legal campaign explicitly designed, according to Betty's account and later analysis of the case, not merely to win custody or a favorable settlement, but to punish her for the act of leaving. The California legal system, still catching up in the 1980s to the reality of how divorce could be weaponized by a wealthy, legally sophisticated spouse, gave Dan enormous room to wage exactly this kind of campaign, delaying proceedings, running up legal costs Betty struggled to match, using his professional relationships within the local legal community to his advantage. It is worth being precise about what makes this pattern distinct from ordinary post-divorce conflict, because divorce is difficult and adversarial for almost everyone, and it would be both inaccurate and unfair to pathologize every contentious separation. The distinguishing feature, according to researchers who study high-conflict and lethal divorces specifically, is not the presence of anger or even litigation aggression. It is the object of the anger and the apparent goal underlying the aggression. In an ordinary difficult divorce, even a bitter one, both parties are generally oriented, however imperfectly, toward eventually reaching some resolution. A settlement, a custody arrangement, a conclusion that allows both people to move forward with their lives. In the pattern we are describing, the entitled partner's underlying orientation is different in a way that becomes visible, in hindsight, as genuinely alarming. Not toward resolution, but toward restoration of control, or failing that, toward punishment severe enough to ensure the wife who left him understands, on some level, the cost of having done so. This is the specific psychological transition from entitlement expressed as charm to entitlement expressed as control to entitlement expressed as punishment that transforms an ordinary painful divorce into something categorically more dangerous. And it explains a pattern that domestic violence researchers and family court professionals have documented with real consistency. That the period of greatest danger in these relationships is not, contrary to popular assumption, during the marriage itself, however unhappy, but specifically during and immediately after the separation, when the entitled partner's sense of control has been most acutely and undeniably threatened, and before any new equilibrium, legal, financial, custodial, had time to establish itself. The FBI's uniform crime reporting data and multiple academic studies on intimate partner homicide converge on this same finding from different angles. Separation is consistently identified as one of the single most significant risk factors for lethal violence in relationships that have exhibited controlling behavior. This is precisely why domestic violence advocates so consistently emphasize, to anyone attempting to leave a controlling partner, that the period immediately surrounding departure, not years into a difficult marriage, but the weeks and months around actually leaving, is frequently the most dangerous window of the entire relationship, requiring the most careful safety planning rather than less. Understanding this collapse, the precise mechanism by which entitlement converts the shame of rejection into the fuel for escalating rage, is not an abstract psychological exercise. It is the single most important piece of the blueprint we set out to build at the beginning of this hour, because it reframes something that so often gets treated, in media coverage of these cases, as inexplicable, as a mystery, as a good man who simply snapped. He did not snap. He responded, according to the internal logic of an entitlement structure that had been operating quietly for years, to the single event that structure was least equipped to survive. Being told, by the person whose deference he had organized his entire identity around, that she was done deferring. What happens next, the specific forms this rage takes, the systems it weaponizes, the violence it sometimes escalates into, is the subject of the section that follows, and it is where the pattern moves from psychology into something closer to strategy. It is worth noting that divorce filing itself, while the clearest and most common trigger for this collapse, is not the only one. Researchers who study lethality risk in intimate partner relationships have identified a cluster of related events that carry similarly elevated danger, precisely because each represents its own version of the same underlying threat, a visible, undeniable loss of control that an entitled partner cannot reframe or explain away. A wife beginning a new relationship, even well after a separation is legally finalized, frequently triggers a fresh escalation, because it represents proof, impossible to dispute, that she has moved on entirely, that whatever residual hope of reconciliation or restored control the entitled partner had been privately nursing is now definitively foreclosed. A custody ruling that does not go his way carries similar weight, not necessarily because he was deeply invested in day-to-day parenting, but because losing a custody fight is processed, within the entitlement framework we have described, as a public, legally documented defeat. A formal ruling that his account of the marriage, his fitness, his authority, has been rejected by an institution whose judgment he cannot simply out-argue the way he might in a private conversation. Even something as seemingly minor as a former wife's growing financial independence, a new job, a promotion, evidence that she is building a stable, self-sufficient life without him, can register as its own kind of injury, undermining the narrative, often maintained privately for years after a divorce, that she cannot actually survive or succeed without him. This is why domestic violence advocates consistently caution that risk in these relationships does not simply decline in a straight line as time passes after a separation. It can spike again, sometimes years later, around any of these subsequent milestones, which is part of why long-term safety planning, protective order renewal, and sustained vigilance remain important well beyond the immediate aftermath of a divorce filing, even in cases where the initial separation period passed without serious incident. If narcissistic entitlement explains why the collapse happens, and narcissistic injury explains the emotional mechanism underneath it, what remains to be understood is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire pattern. How methodical, how patient, and how strategically executed the response to that collapse so often turns out to be. This is the piece that most directly contradicts the crime of passion framing that dominates popular understanding of these cases, and it is the piece with the strongest, most consistent evidentiary support across the cases researchers have studied. The popular imagination of domestic violence homicide tends to picture a single explosive moment, a man overcome by grief or rage in an instant of weakness, acting in a way he would never have planned and can barely explain afterward. The documented reality, in case after case involving the entitlement pattern we have been tracing, looks almost nothing like this. It looks like a campaign, unfolding over months or even years, escalating through a series of distinct and identifiable phases, each one a calculated attempt to restore the control that the separation stripped away, each one becoming more severe as the previous phase fails to achieve its goal. The first phase of this campaign is almost always legal and financial, because these are the tools most immediately available to a man who has spent his career building professional competence and resources, and because they carry the additional advantage of being difficult to characterize to outsiders as abuse at all. This is the phase family law professionals sometimes describe as litigation abuse. Using the legal system itself and its inherent costs, delays, and asymmetries as a weapon rather than a neutral mechanism for resolving disputes. It looks like filing endless motions, not because any of them are likely to succeed, but because each one requires the other party to spend money on legal representation she may not have, and to spend emotional energy responding to an accusation or demand she now has to treat seriously. It looks like weaponizing custody disputes specifically, not necessarily because the father genuinely believes the mother is unfit, but because a custody fight is one of the few remaining levers available to inflict real, sustained pain on a former spouse, using the children as the mechanism. It looks like hiding or manipulating shared assets, delaying financial disclosures, or structurally impoverishing a former partner during the exact period she most needs financial stability to rebuild an independent life. Dan Broderick's legal campaign against Betty followed this pattern with a precision that, in retrospect, reads less like an ordinary contentious divorce and more like a demonstration of exactly how effectively a resourced, legally sophisticated entitled spouse could weaponize the system against a partner with far fewer resources and far less standing within the local legal community. The divorce dragged on for years. The financial terms shifted repeatedly and, according to Betty's account, punitively. The custody arrangement became a recurring battlefield. And crucially, Betty's own escalating desperation and rage in response to this campaign, the harassing phone calls, the vandalism, the increasingly public confrontations, became, in the hands of Dan's allies and eventually much of the watching public, evidence of her instability rather than evidence of the pressure being applied to her. This is one of the most insidious features of the litigation abuse phase. It frequently succeeds in provoking exactly the kind of visible, unstable reaction from the targeted partner that then gets used in court and in public opinion to discredit her underlying grievances. Psychologists who study abusive relationships have a name for this specific maneuver, one that recurs across an enormous range of cases well beyond the domestic violence context. DARVO, an acronym standing for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. The pattern is precise and repeatable. Confronted with an accusation of mistreatment, the entitled partner first denies the underlying behavior, often with real, convincing sincerity, because the denial is frequently supported by his own genuinely held belief that he did nothing wrong. Recall that the entitlement structure organizes his entire perception of the relationship around the premise that his needs and priorities were simply the natural order of things, which makes accusations of mistreatment feel, to him, not like an uncomfortable truth, but like an actual falsehood. He then attacks the credibility of the person raising the accusation, often by highlighting her angriest, least composed moments frequently produced, whether he acknowledges this or not, by the pressure of his own campaign against her. And finally, he reverses the victim and offender roles entirely, positioning himself as the actual injured party. The reasonable man being unfairly persecuted by an unstable, vindictive ex-wife, a framing that requires no conscious deception to sustain, because by this point in the pattern, it is often the framing he has come to sincerely believe. This is precisely the framing that shaped much of the public narrative around Betty Broderick, both during the marriage's collapse and for years afterward. A narrative in which her genuinely alarming behavior in the years leading up to the shooting became the central, most visible fact of the story. While the years of documented pressure and humiliation that preceded and provoked much of that behavior receded into the background, treated as context rather than cause. Untangling that framing is not an exercise in excusing what she ultimately did. It is an exercise in seeing the full sequence clearly enough to understand how a marriage organized around one partner's entitlement produces, with such disturbing regularity, exactly the kind of chaotic, self-destructive reaction from the other partner that then gets mistaken, by courts and by the public alike, for the story's actual beginning. When the legal and financial phase fails to fully restore the sense of control the entitled partner is seeking, and it very often does fail because a former spouse who has genuinely left is definitionally no longer available to be controlled through the marriage itself, the pattern frequently escalates into a second phase: surveillance and psychological pressure. This looks like repeated unwanted contact, framed as necessary communication about children or shared finances, but functioning primarily as a mechanism to maintain presence in the former partner's life and monitor her movements toward independence. It looks like showing up unannounced at her home, her workplace, or wherever she has begun building a life without him. It looks, in a significant number of documented cases, into what legal systems now formally recognize as stalking, a pattern of behavior explicitly designed to instill fear and reassert control precisely because more conventional avenues of control have been closed off. Research into stalking behavior in the context of intimate partner violence, conducted extensively by forensic psychologists and criminologists over the past several decades, has identified this specific category, sometimes termed rejected stalkers, as carrying a distinctly elevated risk of escalation to physical violence compared to other stalking motivations. The underlying psychology tracks precisely with everything we have described. A stalker in this category is not primarily seeking a reunion out of love. He is seeking the restoration of control, and reconciliation is simply one acceptable outcome among several, with punishment and even violence remaining available as alternate paths to the same underlying psychological goal, should reconciliation prove unattainable. The third and final phase, in the fraction of cases where the pattern escalates this far, is physical violence. And it is essential, given everything we have established about the methodical nature of the preceding phases, to resist the framing of this violence as impulsive or unplanned. Forensic analysis of intimate partner homicides consistently identifies substantial evidence of premeditation in a significant proportion of cases, including in circumstances that were initially characterized in media coverage or even in early legal proceedings as sudden or explosive. Weapons acquired in advance. Specific timing chosen to maximize access or minimize the likelihood of intervention. In some cases, extensive advance planning around alibis, disposal, or escape. This is not universally true of every case in this category. Human behavior resists perfect categorization, and some violence genuinely does erupt with less premeditation than other instances. But the pattern is common enough and well documented enough that researchers increasingly caution against the reflexive assumption that domestic violence homicide represents a loss of control, when the evidence so often points instead toward the disturbing opposite, an attempt to seize it, executed. With the same deliberateness the man had once brought to his career, his courtship, and his long campaign through the family court system. The Watts case again offers a striking illustration of this deliberateness, precisely because early media coverage initially framed it in language closer to the crime of passion narrative this entire hour has been arguing against. A devastated husband, initially appearing on camera pleading for his missing family's safe return, before the investigation revealed a starkly different sequence of events. Cell phone records, surveillance footage, and the physical evidence eventually assembled by investigators demonstrated a level of logistical planning around disposal of the bodies, timing relative to his mistress's schedule, and his own carefully rehearsed public statements that bore no resemblance to a man who had simply lost control in a moment of overwhelming emotion. The gap between his composed, grieving public performance in the days immediately following the murders and the methodical reality investigators eventually uncovered is, in miniature, the entire double-life pattern this hour has traced, compressed into a matter of days rather than years. Further evidence that the underlying mechanism does not require a lengthy marriage or an elaborate legal battle to operate. It requires only the same underlying entitlement, triggered by the same underlying threat to a man's sense of control over his own life, expressed through the same disturbing combination of outward composure and private calculation. Dan Broderick's death, whatever the ultimate legal and moral judgment on Betty Broderick's culpability for it, and reasonable people, including juries across 2 separate trials, reached different conclusions on that question, occurred only after years of exactly this kind of legal and psychological campaign had already been waged, largely by Dan against Betty. It is a genuinely uncomfortable feature of the Broderick case, one that complicates any simple narrative, that the eventual physical violence was committed by the entitled party's target rather than by the entitled party himself. A reminder that the psychological pressure generated by this pattern can, in some cases, produce catastrophic responses from the person on the receiving end of it, rather than only from the person applying it. This does not erase Dan's own documented behavior throughout the marriage and divorce, nor does it excuse what Betty ultimately did. It complicates the picture in a way that is worth sitting with honestly, rather than flattening into a simpler story than the evidence supports. What the broader pattern makes clear, looking across dozens of documented cases beyond the Brodericks, is that the specific outcome, who ultimately commits violence and against whom, depends on a wide range of individual situational factors. But the underlying engine in case after case where post-separation violence occurs is remarkably consistent. An entitled partner's inability to tolerate the loss of control represented by a separation he did not choose, expressed first through legal and financial pressure, then through surveillance and psychological intimidation, and in the most severe cases, through violence explicitly aimed at restoring, through force, what could no longer be restored through relationship. The surveillance phase, in particular, has been transformed and, in a real sense, industrialized by technology in ways that make it substantially more effective and substantially harder to escape than it was even a generation ago. Where an entitled partner in the 1980s might have relied on driving past a former wife's house or questioning mutual friends about her movements, contemporary offenders have access to an entire ecosystem of tools originally designed for entirely different purposes. Shared family phone plans that reveal location data, spyware applications marketed for parental monitoring but trivially repurposed to track a former partner, shared cloud photo and calendar accounts that continue silently syncing. Location and activity data long after a couple has physically separated, GPS trackers small enough to be hidden inside a vehicle without detection. Domestic violence organizations have documented a sharp rise over the past decade in survivors reporting exactly this kind of technology-facilitated stalking, and law enforcement and legal systems have, in many jurisdictions, struggled to keep pace with statutes and evidentiary frameworks originally written for a world of physical surveillance rather than digital. This technological dimension matters for our broader argument because it reinforces, rather than contradicts, the premeditation we described earlier. Setting up covert tracking, maintaining access to shared digital accounts after a separation, monitoring a former partner's movements with this level of persistence and technical sophistication. None of this happens accidentally, in a moment of impulsive rage. It requires planning, patience, and a sustained, deliberate investment of effort over time, all of it oriented toward the same underlying goal that has animated the entire pattern since the moment of separation. Restoring, through whatever means remain available, a sense of control that the entitled partner cannot tolerate having lost. Forensic psychologists who conduct threat assessments in domestic violence contexts have developed structured tools specifically to help identify which cases within this broader pattern carry the highest risk of escalating to lethal violence, precisely because not every case involving coercive control and narcissistic entitlement ends in homicide, and distinguishing higher-risk cases from lower-risk ones matters enormously for how limited protective resources get allocated. The danger assessment instrument developed by Jacqueline Campbell, now used widely by advocates, law enforcement, and courts across the country, asks a structured series of questions covering exactly the risk factors this hour has traced. Has the violence increased in frequency or severity? Does he have access to a weapon? Has he ever threatened to kill her or himself? Has he ever tried to choke her? Is he unemployed? Does he control most or all of her daily activities? Is she afraid he might kill her? That final question, in Campbell's research, turns out to be one of the single strongest predictors available. A victim's own gut assessment of her risk, it turns out, correlates powerfully with actual outcomes, a finding that carries an important practical implication. When a woman describes fear of this kind, in this specific context, that fear deserves to be treated as data, not dismissed as anxiety or exaggeration. It is also worth naming, directly, the role firearms play in this final phase of the pattern, because the data here is unambiguous in a way that few other risk factors are. Access to a firearm, in the context of a relationship already marked by coercive control and a recent or impending separation, is associated with a dramatic increase in the likelihood that a domestic violence situation will end in homicide. This is precisely why many of the legal reforms advocates have pushed hardest for in the years since cases like the Brodericks first drew national attention involve exactly this intersection. Laws requiring the surrender of firearms upon the issuance of a protective order, for instance, remain inconsistently enforced across different jurisdictions, and the gap between the law as written and the law as actually implemented continues to cost lives in ways that are unlike so much of the psychology we have described tonight, genuinely and directly addressable through policy. What remains, after the legal proceedings conclude, after the verdicts are read and the sentences handed down, is not resolution. It is a different kind of aftermath entirely, one carried disproportionately by the people who had the least power inside the original dynamic and who are asked afterward to somehow build a life on the other side of it. For the children of these marriages, the weight is particularly severe, and it is worth being direct about something the Broderick case illustrates with unusual clarity. Children in these situations are rarely bystanders to the entitlement pattern we have described. They are frequently drawn directly into it, used, whether consciously or not, as leverage in the custody battles that so often constitute the first phase of an entitled partner's post-separation campaign. Kim and Dan Broderick Jr., along with their younger siblings, spent their adolescence inside a custody dispute that was, according to extensive reporting and their own later reflections, less about their actual well-being and more about which parent would win. And then, after the shooting, they lost their father to homicide and their mother to a life sentence, left to construct an adult identity out of a childhood defined by a conflict neither of them had any power to end. Research into the long-term outcomes for children who grow up inside high-conflict, coercively controlled marriages consistently documents elevated rates of anxiety, difficulty with trust and attachment in their own adult relationships, and a particular, painful form of loyalty conflict. A sense of having to choose between parents, or between competing versions of the truth, that can persist for decades after the parents themselves are no longer part of each other's lives. This dynamic is compounded, in a meaningful number of cases, by a specific tactic that family court professionals have increasingly come to recognize as its own distinct pattern within the broader entitlement framework. Using the children not merely as leverage in a custody negotiation, but as active instruments for discrediting the other parent's account of the marriage, coaching or subtly encouraging a child's loyalty toward the entitled parent's version of events in ways that can permanently distort a child's relationship with the parent who was actually, in most of these documented cases, the one trying to protect them. Family court professionals debate the precise clinical boundaries of this phenomenon extensively, and it remains a genuinely contested area of both research and practice, but the underlying pattern, a parent who treats his children's perception of their mother as one more front in an ongoing campaign to control the marriage's narrative, appears with real consistency across the cases this pattern describes, and it represents, in the view of many child psychologists who work with these families, one of the most durable and least visible forms of harm the entire dynamic produces. The Broderick children's own adult reflections on their parents' story, offered across the decades of interviews and documentaries that followed the case, capture this weight with particular clarity. They have spoken at different points and with different emphases about loving both of their parents while being unable to fully forgive either of them. Their father for the years of humiliation their mother endured, and for the affair that ended the marriage. Their mother for pulling the trigger that ended their father's life and permanently altered all of their futures. There is no clean resolution available to children who grow up inside this pattern, and one of the more sobering findings from research into these family systems is that the absence of clean resolution is not a temporary state to be outgrown. It is, for many of these children, simply the shape their adult lives take. For the surviving partner, in cases where the entitled partner's campaign escalates to violence and she survives it, or in the more common cases where the campaign never reaches violence but does succeed in inflicting severe financial, psychological, and legal harm, the aftermath carries its own particular weight. Rebuilding financial independence after years of coercive control, and frequently a deliberately punishing divorce settlement, is a process that can take the better part of a decade. Rebuilding trust in one's own perception of reality, after years of a relationship dynamic explicitly designed to make her doubt her own account of events, is, according to therapists specializing in this population, often even harder, and often the work that continues longest after every legal matter has formally concluded. And there is a broader systemic weight as well. The question of what the institutions meant to protect people in exactly this situation actually managed to do, in case after case, before the worst outcomes occurred. Family courts, structurally designed around an assumption of two reasonably good faith parties working toward a fair resolution, remain, according to extensive research and advocacy in this space, poorly equipped to identify and respond to the specific pattern we have described tonight. A pattern in which one party's apparent reasonableness in the courtroom bears little relationship to his private behavior, and in which the visible desperation and anger of the party being targeted is so easily and so damagingly mistaken for the underlying problem rather than a response to it. Domestic violence advocates have spent decades pushing for family courts to adopt more sophisticated risk assessment tools. Instruments like the danger assessment developed by nursing researcher Jacqueline Campbell, designed specifically to identify the constellation of behaviors most correlated with escalation to lethal violence, and for judges, evaluators, and law enforcement to receive better training in recognizing coercive control as a pattern distinct from, and often more dangerous than, any single identifiable incident of physical violence. That advocacy has been slow, chronically underfunded, and met with persistent institutional resistance, in no small part because recognizing coercive control as a formal legal category requires courts to weigh evidence, patterns of behavior over years, testimony about psychological rather than physical harm, the specific and often subtle mechanics of financial and social isolation, that the traditional architecture of criminal and family law was never particularly well designed to evaluate. Changing that architecture, advocates argue, is not a minor procedural adjustment. It is a fundamental rethinking of what evidence of danger is actually supposed to look like, one case, one hearing, and one skeptical judge at a time. There is also a professional dimension to this systemic weight worth naming directly, because it complicates any simple story about villains and institutions. Family court judges are, in most jurisdictions, generalist judicial officers, rotated through family court dockets as part of a broader career, rather than specialists trained extensively in the psychology of coercive control, or the specific evidentiary patterns that distinguish a genuinely high-conflict but ultimately safe divorce from one carrying real lethality risk. Custody evaluators, often psychologists or social workers appointed to assess a family's situation over the course of a handful of interviews and observations, are working with an inherently limited window into a dynamic that, as we have spent this entire hour establishing, is specifically designed by one party to be invisible to exactly this kind of short-term outside observation. None of this excuses outcomes that fail victims, but it does help explain why they occur with the frequency they do, and why advocacy in this space has increasingly focused not on individual blame, but on structural reform, mandatory training requirements for family court personnel, specialized domestic violence dockets staffed by judges with specific expertise, and evidentiary standards that give appropriate weight to patterns of behavior over time rather than requiring the kind of single, dramatic, easily proven incident that coercive control, by its very nature, so rarely produces. There is also a role available to the people who exist entirely outside the legal system. The friends, family members, and colleagues who occupy exactly the position this hour has described as most susceptible to the double life's distorting effect, and who are, for that very reason, uniquely positioned to interrupt it if they choose to take seriously what they are seeing rather than defaulting to the more comfortable assumption that surely there are two sides to every story. Domestic violence advocates consistently emphasize a small set of concrete practices that meaningfully improve outcomes for people caught inside this pattern. Believing a friend's account of her own relationship rather than weighing it against a charming public performance she has no ability to compete with. Maintaining contact and connection even when a controlling partner is actively working to isolate her, since continuity of relationship is precisely what makes eventual departure practically possible, and recognizing that the period of greatest danger arrives not during the marriage's unhappy middle years, but specifically around separation, which is exactly when a support network's vigilance and practical help matter most, not least. None of this requires special training or professional credentials. It requires, mostly, a willingness to resist the himpathy reflex described earlier, to notice when an entitled man's public charm is doing more work in a friend group's collective judgment than the account of the woman who actually lived inside the marriage, and to choose deliberately to weight her testimony accordingly. Workplaces, too, have begun to play a more active role in recent years, particularly as awareness of technology-facilitated stalking and post-separation harassment has grown. A number of larger employers have developed formal domestic violence response protocols. Flexible scheduling and safety accommodations for employees navigating a dangerous separation, workplace security measures when a former partner is known to have made threats, and paid leave policies specifically designed to give survivors the practical breathing room that safety planning and legal proceedings require. These interventions remain unevenly available, concentrated disproportionately among larger and better-resourced employers, but their expansion over the past decade reflects a broader, slowly growing recognition that the danger this pattern produces does not stay neatly confined within the walls of a single household, and that the institutions surrounding a family, courts, employers, extended communities, all have some role to play in either reinforcing the entitled partner's control or helping to interrupt it. Some of that progress has genuinely occurred. A number of states have, in the years since the Broderick case first made headlines, passed legislation explicitly recognizing coercive control as a form of domestic abuse in its own right, independent of physical violence, allowing courts to weigh it in custody and protective order determinations in ways that were simply unavailable to Betty Broderick and women like her in the 1980s. Protective order processes in many jurisdictions have become faster and more accessible, though advocates continue to point out how inconsistently they are actually enforced once granted. Awareness of the separation assault phenomenon has spread meaningfully among law enforcement and advocacy organizations, even if it has not yet translated into a system reliably capable of intervening before tragedy rather than after it. What has not changed, and what this pattern makes uncomfortably clear, is the underlying psychology itself. Narcissistic entitlement is not a product of any particular decade, legal system, or cultural moment. It is a recurring feature of human personality, present in every era, and the specific catalyst we have spent this hour examining, the loss of control represented by a partner's decision to leave, will continue to trigger the same underlying response in the same category of men, regardless of how sophisticated our courts eventually become at recognizing it. The value of understanding the pattern, then, is not that it offers a guarantee of prevention. It is that it offers, to the people most at risk of encountering it, something that was largely unavailable to Betty Broderick in real time. Language for what is happening to her, evidence that her experience fits a recognized and well-documented pattern rather than being an isolated private failure, and crucially, a clearer sense of exactly when the danger is most likely to intensify. Not during the hardest years of an unhappy marriage, but in the specific, vulnerable window immediately. Surrounding the decision to leave it, we began this hour by insisting that the Broderick case was not the destination but the starting point, a single, exhaustively documented example of a pattern that recurs far beyond the specifics of one marriage, one profession, one decade. Having traced that pattern from its earliest, almost invisible fractures through the double life it sustains, the collapse that exposes it, and the escalating campaign that so often follows, it should be clear by now why that reframing matters. Dan and Betty Broderick's story is compelling, in part because it is so thoroughly documented. Recorded phone calls, extensive legal filings, 2 full criminal trials, decades of subsequent reporting and reflection. But the underlying mechanism it illustrates is not confined to San Diego in the 1980s. It is operating right now in an unknown number of marriages that look, from the outside, entirely ordinary, wearing exactly the kind of mask we described at the beginning: charming, successful, well-liked, right up until the moment someone decides to stop performing her role in it. That is the weight this pattern leaves behind, and it is the reason understanding it, clearly and without the comforting distortions of the crime of passion narrative, matters well beyond any single case. The blueprint is not a mystery. It has been documented, studied, and named by researchers for decades. What remains urgently unfinished is building a system, legal, social, and cultural, actually capable of recognizing it before it finishes writing its final chapter. There is a particular kind of discomfort in ending a documentary like this one without a clean resolution, and it would be dishonest to manufacture one where none exists. Betty Broderick remains in prison. Dan Broderick has been dead for over 3 decades. Their children carry a story that will never fully close for them, and the pattern that produced their family's tragedy continues to produce new tragedies, in new houses, under new names, on a schedule no one can predict and few institutions are yet equipped to interrupt in time. What this hour has offered is not a solution to that problem. It is a map, assembled from decades of clinical research, criminological data, and the exhaustively documented record of cases like the Brodericks, the Watts family, and others we have covered across this channel, of exactly how the danger builds, stage by stage, from a courtship that felt like the best months of someone's life to a collapse that felt, to everyone watching from outside, entirely without warning. The map matters because warning, it turns out, was always available. It was available in the earliest fractures, in the questions that sounded like concern and functioned as surveillance, in the generosity that always seemed to come with unstated conditions attached. It was available in the growing gap between the man everyone else described and the man only one person actually lived with. It was available most urgently of all in the specific, well-documented spike in danger that follows a separation, a spike domestic violence advocates have been trying to make common knowledge for decades, with only partial success. None of this map guarantees safety. Human behavior remains, in the end, resistant to perfect prediction, and no pattern, however well documented, can account for every variable in every individual case. But a pattern named clearly enough, understood widely enough, and taken seriously early enough is still, according to everyone who has spent a career studying this specific form of violence, the single best tool available for changing how these stories end. Not after the fact, in a courtroom decades later, but while there is still time for them to end differently. We will return to San Diego, and to the Brodericks specifically, in future videos on this channel, because their case remains one of the most thoroughly documented windows available into exactly the pattern this hour has traced. But we wanted this time to step back far enough to see the pattern itself clearly, not as a strange and singular tragedy that happened to one particular family in one particular decade, but as a blueprint written into a specific, recognizable, and disturbingly common configuration of the human psyche, one that will keep producing the same essential story, with different names attached, for as long as it continues to go unrecognized until it is far too late.